Hello guys, welcome to our new lesson, relative clauses. The point of view that we are going to take on this topic is not on formation of relative clauses. This is something you are pretty good at already. You have studied this in previous subjects. So our focus on this subject is about the analysis of relative clauses in a composition. We are going to learn to identify them, and we are going to learn what words introduce them, and we are going to learn about relative clauses from a more technical, from a more grammatical point of view. So let's talk about the relative clause. By this point we are familiar with the parts that make up a clause. Remember, they are pretty similar to sentences, but they cannot transmit a meaning by themselves. They need context. They need to be part of something bigger. So, we know that clauses have an introductory word, a subject, and a verb. Remember that sometimes the subject is not present because the introductory word performs the role of the subject. That is true for some noun clauses, and that is also true for some relative clauses. Relative clauses give extra information about a noun or a noun equivalent. A noun equivalent can be a pronoun. A noun equivalent can also be a noun clause. So if they provide extra information about a noun, so we know that the role they perform is that of adjectives. For this reason, some time ago, relative clauses were also called adjective clauses. This is not very common anymore, however. The words that introduce relative clauses are called relative pronouns. There are 5 different relative pronouns. They are who, whom, that, which, and whose. Similarly, we have 3 relative adverbs that can also introduce relative clauses. These are where, when, and why. For easier understanding, when I talk about a relative pronoun, I am going to be referring to the relative adverbs as well, okay? So we are going to consider these 8 different words as relative pronouns. But again, technically speaking, we only have 5 relative pronouns, and the other 3 are relative adverbs. If you remember our lesson on pronouns, you will remember that the pronoun substitutes a noun. This noun is the antecedent of the pronoun. Well, that's in the most general term. Now, remember that there are some pronouns that require by force to have an antecedent. Other pronouns do not require an antecedent. Relative pronouns are some of those pronouns that by force require an antecedent. If you do not have an antecedent for a relative clause, then for sure that clause is not a relative clause. You gotta remember this. The antecedent is very important. The antecedent is the noun or the noun equivalent that the relative pronoun takes the place of. I have an example for you. The raid took place in La Campanera. The raid happened early in the morning. So if you check those 2 sentences, you will find that they have a common subject. Yes. So I can turn the second sentence into a clause. I can make it a relative clause, and then the antecedent is going to be the word raid. So I am going to substitute this by which, or I can also substitute it by that. And in some cases, I can even use the word where, the relative adverb where, in order to create a relation between these two concepts. So, when I turn the second sentence into a clause, it would say that happened early in the morning. I am using that instead of the riot. The riot happened early in the morning. And I am going to use this clause as an adjective. So it is going to become a part of the independent sentence. Now that we have defined the importance of the antecedent in order to create the relative clause, it is important to discuss where the relative clause is actually placed. Now, by general rule, the relative clause has to be placed right next to the word that it modifies, right after it. Now, there are exceptions, however, because, for example, a prepositional phrase that acts as an adjective that is modifying the same word, the same antecedent, takes precedence over the relative clause. In other words, a prepositional phrase, when acting as an adjective, goes before a relative clause when they modify the same word. Now, but again, I repeat, by general rule, the relative clause is placed right next to the word that it modifies. So, if in taking again the original sentence that I gave you, the raid took place in La Campanera, and I want to include the relative clause, then the new sentence should say the raid that happened early in the morning took place in La Campanera. So that's the way we organize the information, that's the way we place this new clause. In order to use the relative pronouns, it is important that we consider that they establish different relationships among ideas. Some relative pronouns are only used for people, and some other relative pronouns are used for objects and concepts as well. For example, the relative pronouns who and whom are used for people, both of them. However, who is used only in the subject position in the clause. Whom, on the other hand, is used in the object position in the clause. The relative pronouns, they are still pronouns, right? And as such, they must be performing the role of a noun. So we'll say that who, when used in a clause, is going to be the subject of the clause, and whom, on the other hand, is going to be a sort of object. For example, it's going to be a direct object, object of an infinitive, etc. Right? But that is a study that we are going to perform later when we study the sentence elements again, when we revisit this concept of sentence elements. But we are going to consider structures, constructions that are a bit more complex. Which, on the other hand, is used for things, it's used for concepts, and it's used for animals in the subject or the object position in the clause. Check out that which is not used for people. That, on the other hand, is the most, I would say, the most polyphacetic relative pronoun, because it can be used for people, it can also be used for things, for concepts, for animals, and it can be used in the subject position, or it can be used in the object position as well. So that is very polyphacetic. It can take the place of who, it can take the place of which, it can even take the place of whom. So yeah, that happens with that. And then we have whose, which is used again for people, for things, for concepts, for animals. but it is only used in the object position in the clause, only in the object position. You will not find whose as acting as the subject of the clause. You gotta pay attention that this pronoun also possesses, it also exhibits a genitive function, right? Because it shows possession. Okay guys, let's see the previous information applied in context with some examples. Check out the first sentence. Sakura met Sasuke, who was her instant crush, in the village of Konoha. Now, the relative clause is who was her instant crush. Remember that the relative clause is going to be placed right next to the word that it modifies. So in this case, the antecedent is Sasuke. I am using the word who, the relative pronoun who, introducing the relative clause, which tells me that the antecedent is a person, right? And by using the word who, I am saying that this word is the subject of the relative clause. And as you can see, it's true. Who was. So who is acting as the subject. Let's check the other example. Sakura met Sasuke, whom she invited to her graduation in the village of Konoha. As you can see, both sentences are pretty similar. Now I am using whom, which means that the antecedent is a person, but it means that the relative pronoun is not acting as the subject, it's acting as a sort of object. Remember again, the object in the clause. I am not talking about the object of the sentence, only the clause. So, whom she invited to her graduation. Now, if you want to know why this is an object, it's actually pretty simple. What is the antecedent of whom? Well, obviously it's Sasuke, right? So if you replace this word whom by Sasuke, the clause would read Sasuke she invited to her graduation. That doesn't make sense, right? We need to reorganize this sentence, and it should say she invited Sasuke to her graduation. If Sasuke is acting as the direct object, which it is, right? She invited whom? Sasuke. Then the word whom should also have the same role as Sasuke. So that's why we say that whom is an object relative pronoun. It's actually the direct object of the clause. Now, informally, we can use who instead of whom. However, prescriptivists of English grammar tell us that this is a mistake and we shouldn't do this. But again, informally we do it. So we can also say Sakura met Sasuke, who she invited to her graduation in the village of Konoha. And it is accepted by most of us. Most of us do it, but strictly speaking or academically speaking, especially when we write, this is a no-no, right? We shouldn't do that.